Well, it's been, dare I say, a wild week. I think many of them have been, but more of it in the presidential race. Back to talk with us more about that with these details in mind, Professor Piet Wielhouwer of the Political Science Department at Western Michigan University. Peter, good morning.
Good morning, Richard.
Here we go, huh?
Here we go.
Yeah, man, this is interesting. Let's start with Hillary's pneumonia. Go from there. There were a couple of people who said to me, this is fatal for her campaign. Maybe now, in hindsight, that isn't true, but were you thinking that at all?
I was not thinking that. I've really tried to not take individual events and assign too much consequence to any one single event. I mean, there are differences. So, for example, back when Barack Obama was first running for president, and we had a significant bank problem that happened in late September. That was certainly something that everybody could see. This is a major economic question. Something along these lines, I always try to say, is this going to make a difference for the people who are already supporting Hillary, for people who are already opposed to her, or for people who are on the fence? I don't think it's fatal because people who it would have made a difference for, they've already made their decision.
All right. And so let's turn this around then. She came back and said, I didn't think this was a big deal. Was it a big deal at all?
Well, I think what happens is that it feeds into a general narrative about her being rather opaque and very private in the way that she and Bill Clinton try to maintain their private lives. And I think that she probably didn't think it was going to be a big deal. But, you know, with so many years' experience under her belt in terms of national politics, that really was a miscalculation on her part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when you're in the spotlight, basically this is a long job interview. And the question becomes, is this person healthy enough for the leader of the free world? Not telling us you have pneumonia seems kind of like a big deal.
Well, I guess, I'm thinking that they were concerned about how that would fit into the Trump narrative about her health.
Right.
I think that probably for 70-year-old women, her health is probably just fine and probably typical for 70-year-old women, and probably better given the pace of the campaigning that she's been doing now for several months. My guess is she's in better than average health. Some new health reports did come out yesterday that say that she has normal kind of 70-year-old woman stuff going on, and so I don't think that that by itself that's unnecessarily a problem, but they didn't want to feed into the narrative, and so by coming across as being not transparent about these things, it just fed into that narrative, and now that made it a little bit worse. But I don't think it's the death knell.
Mm-hmm. It is interesting. Age has not come up much in this campaign, but both of these candidates are older, significantly older than Barack Obama was when he was elected, older than George W. Bush was when he was elected. Has age come up at all in these discussions?
I don't think that it has come up, and primarily because there's only a year's difference between the two of them. So it's not really, there's no leverage that one campaign can get over the other by citing age. It's not like Walter Mondale and Ronald Reagan back in 1984. In this case, it's a wash on either side, so there's no point in either side bringing it up.
All right, and nobody else has, I guess.
Well, I mean, people can talk about it. I had conversations with students yesterday about the problems that millennials have with my generation, which is their parents' generation. But I think in general, this is not really an issue. So,
are there millennial voters out there, you think, saying, "What the heck? In 4 years, they're going to be in their middle 70s"?
I don't think that there's any polling out there that evaluates that question. So it doesn't seem that way because what is the option? I mean, they're really these are the two major options. The other candidates are relatively older. I think the expectation is that presidents in general are going to be of the middle and older generation. So I don't think so.
All right, we're talking with Professor Piet Wielhouwer about the presidential race. Piet Wielhouwer with us again this half hour on WBCK from the Poli-Sci Department at Western, talking about the presidential race. You brought up millennials. You hear a lot about that generation, and I don't know whether it's fair or not, but a lot of people saying, they're a weird bunch. Does that extend itself to what you see in this election cycle?
Well, I spend a lot of time with millennials, and so I don't particularly think they're a weird bunch. I think the people who think that they're weird are people who are looking at them kind of from the outside and not really being able to have very many conversations with them. I find them in general to be really thoughtful people. And so what's interesting for me about this from this presidential perspective is that there's a lot of flexibility and unpredictability about their political loyalties. Remember, this is a generation for whom this is their first or second time being able to vote.
Right.
And so as a result, they don't have the long-standing party ties that we have in the older generation, where you, as an adult, you kind of get into this habit or routine of kind of defaulting to one party or the other. And this younger generation does not have that. So what we see with polling, for example, in a Quinnipiac poll that came out this week, is that when the questions are posed in a two-candidate race between Clinton and Trump, young people support 18 to 34-year-olds support Clinton 55% to 34%. But when they expanded the question to include four candidates, such as the Libertarian Johnson or the Green candidate Stein, Hillary Clinton's support goes down to 41%. To 31% in that group from 55%. That's a really significant drop.
Right.
And for Donald Trump, his amount drops by about half as much in this young group. So, I think that what we see here is that the millennial generation don't have these long-standing party ties. And so they're not very happy with Clinton in general. And so she suffers significant loss. This is not, she's having a hard time holding together Barack Obama's voting coalition.
Mm-hmm. Well, and let's not forget, of course, some of these millennials may not have been voting then, but when you put Obama against Hillary Clinton, we saw who shined in that matchup. But this is interesting. Why is it that she cannot appeal to them in this way? This is significant.
Well, I think that those of us who are a little bit older, we've kind of come to this expectation that politicians, we can't really expect them to be forthright and honest. We understand that in politics, there's a bit of shucking and jiving that goes into what it means to be a politician, especially at the national level, when you've got to dovetail from a primary process where you have to be more ideological to a general election process where you need to be more centrist. And I think that what happens with the millennials is that they're not quite so jaded yet. They're not so cynical, and they expect honesty and integrity from public figures. And when they don't see that, I think it alienates them. We certainly know that Hillary Clinton has a significant perception problem with regard to her honesty and integrity, and I think that hits that younger generation more highly. And I think the older generations, we've seen her and her husband on the public stage for 30 years, and so we've already formed our opinions about their honesty and integrity and transparency.
Professor Peter Wielhouwer here with us for a little while longer as we talk about the presidential race this week. Up next, we'll talk a little bit about Donald Trump's visit to Flint yesterday. A few more minutes with Peter Wielhouwer, WMU professor of political science, joins us somewhat regularly to talk about politics, and well, it's enough to talk about right now, I suppose. So enough with Hillary's pneumonia. I suppose she's on the mend now and back on the trail. Today is the schedule anyway. So Donald Trump comes to Flint, and that was yesterday. It presumably was an opportunity for him to try and connect with black voters. He's done this before, and maybe to do so on the level in a town where there's been a lot of publicity about what's gone on, national publicity with what's gone on in the water situation, and it didn't go quite as smoothly as maybe he'd hoped.
Right. Well, there were a couple of aspects to this. One is that there was quite a vigorous opposition to his being there. We saw lots of interviews with people, or an event that was basically saying, "Why are you here? We don't need your help here. You've had nothing to do with us before up until this point in time." But those were all kind of left groups that were really opposed to him anyway.
Right.
But I think the more interesting exchange was what we saw at the Methodist Church, where he was ostensibly there to talk with them and to encourage them in terms of community-based efforts to dealing with this problem. And then he started to go off on Hillary Clinton. And to me, this is a sense of, you don't know your audience. It's like even though he was reading from a prepared script, it's like he was thinking that he was back in front of a Trump rally.
Mm-hmm.
And the pastor stepped up to him and I thought really, really nicely said, this is not why I asked you to come here. This is not why you're here. Please stop talking about this, the politics, and giving a political speech. And to his credit, he stopped. But my sense is this kind of gives you a sense of kind of the tone deafness of the message of Trump toward the African American community, is that he's not going to make very much headway by bashing Hillary Clinton. He needs to be more positive in terms of what are the positive options that the Republicans, or that at least he sees as his candidacy for the community. And I think he still just doesn't get it.
Yeah. So somebody's not paying attention that's giving him the advice here. But, I think his tone has changed some, hasn't it, overall?
He does seem to be, except for the rallies. I mean, I think certainly the rallies, he's still just as much throwing out that red meat. He's still as policy agnostic as he's ever been, and he's much more in terms of kind of rallying up the troops. But it seems like he's making maybe a few fewer outrageous things per day or per week than we've become accustomed to.
Yeah.
So I think that certainly, I think the big change here in this, as we've looked at this over the last few months, is his bringing in Kellyanne Conway to be a campaign manager. She's conventional. She understands how the process works. She's a really, really bright, political consultant, and so I think that she has helped to professionalize his campaign and professionalize him as a candidate, making him generally more conventional than he was up to this point.
Yeah, and professionalize might be a good way to put it. I have been saying, in order to appeal to someone who has not made up their mind yet, he might have to tone it down. And when I say that, some of the stalwarts get after me, why should he tone it down? Well, not you, because the people who like him love that. But, I mean, if you haven't made up your mind, you got to say something to try and appeal to those people, don't you?
This is exactly right, because Donald Trump, I mean, just mathematically, he cannot win the election simply by going after people who already support him. It's just not a winning strategy. The voting numbers simply aren't there. He has to appeal to people who were not motivated by his red meat kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And so going after voters who are more centrist or less ideological, going after voters who are unconnected to the Republican Party, unconnected with the Tea Party, unconnected with the alt-right movement, he's got to go after those people. He risks losing people that are already his supporters, but who are they going to vote for? They're not going to vote for Hillary.
Yeah.
So it's a low-risk, high-reward strategy for moderating a bit, toning it down in order to attract those centrist voters.
Before we go, running out of time, but let's leave on this thought. How do you think these debates are going to go? Are they going to be a circus, or are we going to get serious here?
Richard, that is a $64 question. We simply don't know. He's so unpredictable in the way that he handles these kinds of ad hoc, non-teleprompter events. I think it's really going to be interesting to see if he acts the way he did during the Republican debates, which is basically going for the jugular on a highly personal level, or if he maintains establishes kind of a substantive policy discussion. If it stays on policy, I think it really benefits Hillary Clinton. I think But if he goes for the jugular, I think that's going to turn off those centrist people. It's going to be fascinating, I think, to see what happens. And I think this first debate in particular is going to set the narrative and the tone for how voters are going to perceive them going in, because it's going to be the first one where a very large number of non-Republicans are going to be paying attention to what he says.
All right. We always appreciate your time, Peter. Thank you.
My pleasure. Take care.
Peter Wielhouwer, WMU Poli-Sci Department.